covering our political front here, and Joseph Moreno covering our legal front. Okay, so it's tricky sometimes to wade through all of the different versions that we hear from Rudy Giuliani on things of import, but let's try. So he says that Trump was involved in the Trump Tower Moscow project for the entirety of his campaign. Now, he's tried to kind of backpedal from that and just say that he's leaving open the possibility of this. But let's just talk about what that would mean. That would mean that he was, as the New York Times so clearly spells out, wooing Russia on this massive development project that would benefit him financially a lot, right? As he's making statements, calling on sanctions, Obama-era sanctions to be lifted off of Russia. He's calling on Moscow to find Hillary Clinton's emails. And as he's criticizing NATO, which is totally Kremlin-line. So let's listen.
I believe I would get along very nicely with Putin, okay? And I mean where we have the strength. I don't think you'd need the sanctions. I think that we would get along very, very well. NATO is obsolete. It was 67 years, or it's over 60 years old. It is many countries, doesn't cover terrorism, okay? It covers the Soviet Union, which is no longer in existence. And NATO has to either be rejiggered, changed. Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. They say, Putin likes Trump. And he said nice things about me. He called me a genius. He said we're going to win. That's good. That's not bad. That's good. If we could get along with Russia, wouldn't that be a good thing instead of a bad thing?
You know, Karin, when you heard those things at the time, they were kind of nuts to hear. But now hearing them with the context of knowing that he very possibly or was in negotiations with Russia about a big development project is a very different thing.
It's an extremely different thing. I mean, first of all, there's always been questions about whether the president was pursuing his bottom line in these statements about Russia. And it's a question of ratcheting up the level of bad this potentially is. When he's doing that potentially before he's really a candidate, okay. When he's one of 17 candidates, more problematic. When he's the actual party nominee, extremely problematic. I mean, he was receiving security briefings at one point, too. And then you have to question, is the president saying that he's going to be, doing all of these things because he actually believes in the policy, or because he thinks that it's actually throwing out a gesture to people that he thinks will pay into this project that he's pursuing for a longer-term goal? And that you campaign on what you're going to do as president. That's a scary thing when you're talking about somebody who is then moving into the Oval Office, because even if those specific discussions stop, does that actually stop the speculation or the concern about what he's then doing with the powers of the presidency? You've heard him talk just in the last few days about, reports about the president seriously considering withdrawing from NATO and things that will affect generations of security alliances, of global positioning that could be out the window. And these are all raising more serious questions as to why. Is this really the reason to butter up the Russians for a personal project?
Look at this through the legal lens for us, Joe, because you're a former DOJ and national security prosecutor. When you see him talking about these things that are so pro-Russia, and he has business with Russia, how does that impact the legal side of what he's facing?
Well, Brianna, this is why this story just refuses to die, because there's this ever-growing mountain of circumstantial evidence to show that there are connections here that might support some of the more serious legal allegations that have been floated out there. So, in a vacuum, we could say, let's just be quiet and wait for Special Counsel Mueller to finish his work because we're not worried. But when we learn about these things and we know that not only were there legal reasons, but business reasons for President Trump to possibly want to ingratiate himself with Russia, that's concerning. And that's why it's hard to just ignore that and say, well, let's wait to see what happens, because we keep learning things every day.
And Michael Cohen, Joe, who is running point on this Moscow project, this Trump Tower project there, what he has lied about on this has been of such issue. At first, he said the president was only really in the loop on this January 2016 when all the primary contests were getting going. Then it turns out actually it was as late as June, which is what he told prosecutors. Now you have Giuliani pushing that all the way to the election. But you can see how Michael Cohen, if he was looking out for Trump, would have wanted to shield this from public knowledge, right?
Well, sure. I mean, it's hard enough when you have presidents in the business world and you're mixing finances with politics. And we haven't really had to grapple with this in modern history. I mean, we've had presidents from the business world, the military world, career politicians, but they've always divested themselves. Here, President Trump has not divested himself. Not only that, you have potential dealings with a hostile foreign nation and one in where he's being looked at for possible collusion with, with the campaign. So when you kind of add those things together, I have no doubt President Trump is very aggravated that this story won't die. But again, he keeps giving us reasons to talk about it and to keep it alive and to scrutinize it.
Taking a turn here, Karen, I want to ask you about Chris Christie's book. It's pretty interesting. I mean, this is a juicy read. Quote, far too often he's found himself saddled with the riffraff. That's what he says about Trump. Right. He says he needed to surround himself with high-quality people. But then he goes on to describe the former National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, a Russian lackey and future federal felon. Scott Pruitt, the EPA chief, since departed, greedy and inexperienced. Tom Price, former HHS secretary, since departed, high-flying. AG Jeff Sessions, since departed, not ready for prime time, and former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, a stranger. What do you think about this assessment?
Well, there's kind of like a back and, I mean, first of all, I think there's clearly a lot of turnover in the Trump administration. I think clearly,
I noticed that as I was reading this, right?
I think also, as we've seen, even raising the Giuliani example, who's causing as many messes as he's trying to clean up. Every time he tries to clean one up, he starts another one. I mean, they should have been able to get through this weekend much, much more cleanly than they have because of him. So is it the president or is it everybody around him? I think we know at the outset Trump had difficulty getting the mainstream Republicans to bolster his campaign. They went to Rubio, they went to Jeb Bush, and they wanted to stay away from the president because he was making incendiary statements like the ones that you just listed a few minutes ago about Russia, and now with all these questions around that too, which we didn't even know at the time, but people kept their distance. So Trump took who he had, and yet now he's got this reputation for not really sticking by his people, and so that kind of is just a self-perpetuating problem. Nobody wants to sign up. So is Christie right? Again, in a vacuum, to take Joe's line, yeah, he's right, but this is not the vacuum. I think the GOP has been splintered around the idea of working in the Trump presidency. They're dealing with it. They're trying to promote it as much as they can because it behooves the GOP to be successful and have somebody in the White House. But that doesn't mean that the heart of the party actually agrees with him on most of these things.
Karen, thank you so much, Joe. Really appreciate it.